so Jenny said, you're talking at Agronomy Day, you're going to talk about phosphorus, here's your title, all you need to know about phosphorus. But I've slightly amended it because once I saw the schedule and saw she only gave me a half hour. So all you need to know about phosphorus that I can fit into 25 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to do my best. We're going to go fairly quick. I know we're all experts on phosphorus here because we've been hearing about it for so long. I'm going to do my best. Wave at me if you have a question. I'll be here all day if you want to come talk to me later. I'm not running out, so if we want to talk later about something, just come find me. All right, so let's start with the phosphorus cycle. This is, kind of the basic. We'll start here, and then we'll kind of build our knowledge from there, right? So on this graph, all of the green circles are different forms of phosphorus. All of the the blue rectangles are inputs, and then the red rectangle looking things are losses, right? So we have our phosphorus that exists in the soil solution, right? And you see that arrow that says to plant uptake. So what's here in the soil solution is going to be what's available for the plant. Now, when we add organic sources of fertilizer, so manures, biosolids, or even, as plant residues kind of break down, they add organic phosphorus to the soil. But this phosphorus is not immediately available, right? It needs to be broken down through microbes in the soil. It needs to be mineralized to that solution phosphorus. Okay, so we've got our solution phosphorus, we've got our organic phosphorus. Now, phosphorus, where it's a little different from nitrogen, is, the soil really has a very high affinity for phosphorus. So when we add phosphorus, it's very likely that it's going to leave this solution phase, and it's going to kind of either adsorb to the soil surface, right? So we've got clays with charges, we've got iron, we've got aluminum, and that we call it adsorb. So absorb means you take in, but adsorb means they kind of hang out on the surface together, like a strong handshake, right? But, this phosphorus can eventually be made available into that solution so the plant can take it up. But then we also form these secondary compounds, right? This is a much stronger bond. So, the word here says dissolution. So you actually have to dissolve these particles with like an acid in order to release that phosphorus. So, this phosphorus is not necessarily as available as the phosphorus that's kind of attached to those mineral surfaces. And this is kind of our traditional understanding of phosphorus, right? You put phosphorus down, it's not going to move. It's going to stay in the soil, it's not going to move very easily. So this is kind of where that traditional thinking comes along. And, then we talk about our mineral fertilizers, our inorganics, those kind of add right to that solution pool. And then we have our loss pathways, right? Runoff and erosion, which I'm going to talk about these in a minute. And then, we've got this leaching, and they always note on these figures, it's usually minor. But we know that, it's minor maybe when you think about the whole country, but it's actually a very major loss pathway of phosphorus for us here in the Delmarva region, in our coastal plains type soils. Okay, factors influencing phosphorus availability and mobility. So phosphorus, as I mentioned, the soil has a very high affinity for it, so it doesn't move very far. It's not going to move long distances through the soil, from where it's attached to that clay particle to that plant root, right? So it really only is maybe about 1/4 of an inch that it's actually going to move. And then beyond that, you really need that water because it's the medium for moving those nutrients from the soil to the plant root. So it's not going to move over a very long distance, and it's also not going to move if you've got very dry soil conditions. Crops only use about 10 to 30% of your phosphorus fertilizer in the first year, right? The rest of it, that high affinity for that soil, kind of sucks out that phosphorus and it stays in the soil. And, it'll be used later. It'll eventually break down. Those bonds will eventually break and it will be made available to the plant. But it may initially get tied up in that soil and then released later. Many growers, as we know, have kind of built up these very large reserves. They're storing a lot of that phosphorus in the soil for later use. Most agricultural soils naturally, though, are actually quite low in phosphorus. So, we're seeing these high phosphorus values, soil phosphorus values, because of a long time of, fertilization and build up. And that was the agronomic mentality, right? Build up your soil, feed your soil, build up those concentrations and save it for later. Phosphorus is very tied to soil pH, right? You move too far in either direction out of that optimum range of pH and you're tying up that phosphorus. So you start getting too acid and it's the iron and aluminums that are really forming those stronger compounds and holding on to that phosphorus. But then you start getting too high and then in more calcareous soils, it's that calcium that's actually tying up that phosphorus. So, as if we don't have enough issues with phosphorus that the soil likes to hold on to it, it's really important to be paying attention to your pH because that's also going to affect that affinity for the soil to hold on to that phosphorus. Okay, so phosphorus is not nitrogen. I like to point this out because a lot of times when we talk about, water quality and environmental impacts, we say things like nitrogen and phosphorus, nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's really important to understand that they do behave very differently, right? So reductions in rate will not improve efficiency. So just because you put out less phosphorus is not going to make your system overall more efficient at taking up the phosphorus there. It's not the same as nitrogen. Increases in efficiency will not result in a decrease in loss, right? When we think of nitrogen, we say whatever's left over in the soil, we're going to lose it. So we need to be really efficient and we need to make sure we maximize what that plant can take up so we can minimize our loss to the environment. Phosphorus just doesn't work that way. It's not the same beast. So there is a dubious, if not non-existent, relationship between phosphorus use efficiency and phosphorus loss, right? So it's really critical that we're focusing on decreasing that loss through managing of your timing and your placement. So making sure that phosphorus is getting right where it needs to be at the right exact time that the plant needs to take it up. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit more about the P index. So as we were kind of going through, I say we kind of nationally, we have a national work group of collaborators that, talk about phosphorus issues and updating P indexes. And, we were going through the process of saying we need to update our P indexes. And EPA said, I don't really think that that's necessary. We're putting a lot of effort into this. Why don't we just look at soil test P? Farmers are already, testing their soil. They already have to have it, part of the nutrient management plan. So let's just look at your soil test. And if you're up above the optimum, if you're in that excessive range, you don't need to put out any more phosphorus, it's done. We don't need to waste our time with the P index. And although that's wrong, and I'm going to describe to you why that's wrong, initially, when you look at some data on a graph, I can kind of see where they got this from, right? So let's look at our graph. We've got soil test P on the x-axis, and we've got phosphorus loss, like edge of field phosphorus loss on the y-axis. And we've got a number of fields that are plotted here. This data came from Dr. Sharpley down at Arkansas. So when you plot this, you get a pretty decent curve, right? As your soil test P is going up, you're seeing an increase in that phosphorus loss. So I can kind of understand where they got this from. But let's look a little closer at this data, right? So let's focus on this area down here. So crop optimum is kind of around 50. And then we know that when we get a little bit above 200, we're kind of getting up in that environmental threshold, right? So if we look here on this graph, there's actually not that much of a difference in phosphorus loss, whether you're at 50 soil P or you're up close to 100, right? There's not much happening here. So something else has got to be happening here. Soil test P alone clearly is not telling us the whole picture, right? And we know that because what is soil test P, right? Soil test P is a measure of what the plant sees. How much phosphorus is available for that plant to take up. It's not telling us anything about environmental loss, what happens when there's some left over, right? It's just a measure of what the plant can see. All right, so that was some numbers on a graph. Let's take a look at it in a landscape, right? So this is a watershed that's up in kind of the center of the state in Pennsylvania, and the researchers up at ARS have researched the heck out of this watershed. It's a pretty small watershed. It's there with the hatched outline, and there's kind of water that runs through this watershed. And they have determined that 90% of the phosphorus that's lost from this entire subwatershed comes from only 10% of the land, right? So these little red spots are where that 90% of that phosphorus is coming from. Okay, so they know this. So now let's overlay a map of soil test P from all the different fields that make up this watershed. So green is low, red is high, okay? We still have our same body of water, and you can see the spots where they know that the phosphorus is coming from, right? So it doesn't add up. There are some spots where it adds up, right? Where we see this red, we've got the high soil test P, and it's definitely contributing some of that phosphorus to that body of water. But then we have some other spots like down here that have really low soil test P. But apparently they're contributing phosphorus to this body of water. And then we've got like this huge field over here that isn't contributing anything. But based on what the EPA has said, this field, there should be no P application on that field because it is contributing loss to that body of water. So we're seeing in the landscape scale, the numbers are just not adding up, right? Okay, so let's add some more fields, some additional fields to this chart. So we've got our same thing. We've got soil test P on the X. We've got P loss on the Y. These are that same set of fields. But notice there was no additional source of phosphorus, right? We're just looking at fields where there was not a recent application of phosphorus. So let's add some fields where there was a P application, right? We've got triple superphosphate, we've got some swine manure, we've got some poultry manure, and our R squared kind of falls apart. So when we're looking at fields that have a P application, which is most fields, right, we see that this relationship between soil P and phosphorus loss kind of falls apart. So you could still have a soil P less than 200, but you've got astronomical losses of P, right? So something else is happening here. And that something else is a transport pathway, right? So we've identified that the soil is a source of phosphorus, as well as some of the other amendments that you apply. But what also you must take into account is the transport pathway. Now, up until this point, I've stolen slides from other people. But these next few slides are mine, and I'm taking credit for them, okay? These are the best darn animations you are going to see, and you are never going to forget phosphorus loss after you see these slides, okay? So let's go through these individual transport pathways and, learn a little more about them, and then we'll get to the P index. Okay, so particulate phosphorus loss. So in this picture, the brown blob is a soil particle. I have labeled it, soil particle. Okay, so we're in a sloped landscape where erosion is very likely, and we've got a soil particle that's got the phosphorus kind of hanging out, adsorbed to that iron and aluminum, and in this example, there's some calcium on there too, right? So we've got these particles that are kind of holding on to that phosphorus, right? And then what happens? We have some kind of a rain event, we have some kind of water moving across the surface, and that whole particle of soil moves across the landscape and eventually ends up in that water body, right? This is erosion, the movement of the entire soil particle. So how do we kind of combat this particular type of phosphorus loss, right? Well, obviously we decrease our erosion, right? If you can keep the soil in place on the surface, then you're decreasing this particular particulate phosphorus loss, right? And how do we do this? Often when we have these fields where there's a lot of erosion, we kind of try to minimize tillage or go to a no-till type system. In this specific type of field where erosion is an issue. All right, and I will mention that, this really was kind of the thought that this was the only way that phosphorus moved. And actually for a long time nationally, like amongst researchers, there was argument that this was the only way that phosphorus moved, right? So as I'm moving on to these next couple pathways, these are still kind of new. We're still learning our understanding of how phosphorus moves. So there's runoff P loss. So now in this slide, this brown blob is actually a pile of manure, right? And we've got our little phosphorus molecules, they're in there. They're not really attached to anything. They're just kind of there loosely within the manure, right? So we've surface applied this manure. We are again in a sloped landscape. So it could be manure, it could be fertilizer, it could be some kind of amendment that contains phosphorus, and it's on the surface. So we get some type of a rain event, right? And water moves across the surface, and what happens? Well, that manure pile is likely not going to move. But that P, that very soluble P that's within that manure, is actually going to solubilize, come out of that manure, and move across the landscape with that runoff. So you actually now are having this phosphorus not attached to anything. It's very soluble. It's 100% available. Whereas in the previous example, that phosphorus was tied up in that soil particle. It's less available. It's more slow release. But this is 100% available, right? So what would we suggest to a producer in this situation to try to combat this phosphorus loss? Well, you'd either decrease your application of that P source, right? Don't put any more soluble P out. Or, increase your contact between that manure and your soil that has a high affinity for that phosphorus, right? So don't surface apply it. Incorporate it. Get it mixed in there with the soil so it's being held on before it gets lost through a rain event. And you know, I want to note that here I'm specifically, my brown blob was in fact a manure pile. And I mentioned that the source here is fertilizer or manure, but it's important to note that the soil actually can be its own source for this very soluble dissolved P, right? And this is still kind of a new concept, this idea of soil P saturation, right? Like your soil has some kind of finite capacity for holding phosphorus. At some point, you're going to overwhelm it, and it's just not going to be able to hold on to any more phosphorus. And you know, so Dr. Sims over at University of Delaware has done a lot of research on this. That as the soil starts getting more saturated, you see increase in loss of that dissolved or that soluble P, right? And you know, we kind of know that this happens, right? We get kind of these layers of stratification after continuous, you know, application of a P source. Your soil P concentration gets very elevated at that surface, right? And it starts to decrease as you go down through the profile. But if you're in this situation where you've got high P concentration at the surface, you're on a slope, and then you've got water moving across it, you know, if there's no quantity, if that soil is unable to hold on to that phosphorus anymore, it's going to be lost. So the soluble P comes not only from your amendments, but it can also come from the soil itself. So the soil itself can also act as a source here for this dissolved P. And then we've got our subsurface P loss, which for a long time, like I said, when I showed you that P cycle, leaching, they said it's usually minor. We don't even talk about it. But we know that this happens here, you know, especially as we go a little further south on the shore. We've got a flat landscape that are close proximity to water. There's artificial drainage. We've got a very high water table that comes up close to the surface. We've got a low clay percentage. So, you know, over time, you apply this phosphorus, the P, whatever form, and it kind of moves through the profile, and it eventually will interact with with an iron, with an aluminum molecule, right? But over time, as you continue this application, all of your available kind of holding sites, they're already holding on to phosphorus, right? So it can't take in anymore. It's like a cup, you've filled that cup, and now it starts overflowing. So as you continue to apply phosphorus in the surface, it kind of moves through that profile. There's nowhere for it to go. There's nothing to hold it. And so it ends up being very quickly shuttled to the nearest body of water, right? So how do we deal with this? Well, again, we can say don't apply any more phosphorus to the surface, but sometimes that's not the way we can go about it. That's not an option. So we suggest in this situation increasing your contact between the soil particles and your phosphorus source. But sometimes this requires deep tillage, right? You've got to get down to that subsoil where it is not saturated with phosphorus. So, you know, it's important to note, the point I'm driving home here is that depending on what the transport pathway is in your individual field, you've got to select the management that is appropriate for the loss that you're seeing. Okay, so again, there's these two types. There's the particulate phosphorus and the dissolved phosphorus. And the quantity that you see is going to depend on, you know, your specific field conditions. So you're going to see a greater percentage of that particulate P where you've got cultivated land. It's going to be decreased if you're in a no-till or a pasture situation. But that dissolved phosphorus, it's going to be much less if you're tilling and you're increasing the contact between that phosphorus and the soil, and you're going to see a lot more of it if you're in a no-till system where this dissolved phosphorus source is surface applied. Okay, so let's look at this one in the landscape as well. So now we're zooming in to that same watershed. This is a couple of fields within that same watershed. Then they're contoured here, and the slope is coming down this way, and there's the body of water down at the bottom. And each of these little sets of flags are monitoring stations, right? They're measuring the edge of field phosphorus loss, right? So we've got this field at the top, the second field, and the third field here. So the orange bars represent the soil P concentration, right? So right away you're looking at it, you're going, well, this field's pretty low, you know, and this one's, it's getting higher, and the third one up top, okay, that's the highest, right? So to go on with this experiment, they said, you know what, this one's low. We're not going to put any additional phosphorus out on this bottom field. And we're going to put more out on this middle field that had the moderate soil P, and we're going to put less. We're still going to put some, but we're going to put less up on that top field, right? And so you would think, on first glance, this field, very high soil P, it's got additions of phosphorus. We're going to have loss from this high field, right? Well, wrong. Because what happened? Transport is what's dominating this situation. There was 100 times more runoff that came off this lower field than that upper field, which translated into 8 times more phosphorus loss coming off of this bottom field than that field, right? So we can't ignore these transport pathways because sometimes that transport is really overriding that source. Just by looking at that P concentration, you might think one thing, but the transport is really what's dominating some of these situations. So that's why we have the P index, right? The point of the P index is to find these red spots where there's both a source of phosphorus and there's a transport pathway acting on it. We call those critical source areas. And so the point of the P index is to identify those. And then moreover, targeting your management practices to those specific areas, right? What's the point of implementing these management practices on this field over here when it's not contributing any phosphorus to the problem, right? We need to be focusing our solution on the areas that are causing the problem. And this really helps us maximize our return on our effort, right? Okay, so now when we replot this, we look at the same fields, but we change that x-axis to your P index value, we see a nice curve. We see a much better relationship. So the P index is really doing a better job of describing what's going on and what's causing this loss of phosphorus. Okay, so the P index takes on many forms, right? We know, we've seen this in Maryland. We've gone from the P index now moving into the PMT. But before the P index that we had like P index version 1, right? The first generation P index created in 1994. And basically the calculation was pretty simple. Add up all the sources, add up all the transports, add them all together, and your final score is going to be your P index score, right? So we implemented it. They kind of took a look at it and they realized that this calculation wasn't really grabbing the number of fields that they thought. It wasn't functioning the way they thought. So we moved to the second generation P index, which was a multiplicative. So we still added up all the sources and we still added up all the transport factors, but we just multiplied them together. And then as this kind of was out in the field and we were seeing how it was working, specifically here in Maryland, we noticed that there was a lot of fields where this was failing. Right? You look at a field in which you know about that field, you say, they should not be applying any more phosphorus here. But for some reason, this calculation was failing us, right? So that's why now we have moved into the third generation, what we call the component multiplicative. This is the form of the PMT that we have now, right? And so what we've actually done is you're still multiplying your source by your transport, but this time you're splitting it out and you're really identifying those individual transport pathways. And so we're doing this because it's more mechanistic. It's giving us a better idea of what's actually happening on your field. And, numerically now, any one pathway can result in a high P index score. So if you're in a situation where erosion is dominating, now, numerically, it will actually come out that way. And you, as the producer, will be able to see, okay, what is my problem here? And how can I better target my management practices to deal with that specific pathway? Okay, I'm missing one part though. So let's take a look at this field. This was a field at the Y, the same field, and we had 4 different tillage practices. So we had no-till, turbo-till, strip-till, and chisel plow. Soil test P, 65, moderate, not too bad. And then we've got 4 tons per the acre of poultry litter, okay? So our source is exactly the same. Same soil test P, we got the same amount of poultry litter added. The transport is the same too, right? Because I said, this is the exact same field. But when we look at the total phosphorus loss, we see that no-till is almost 4 times greater than what we saw with the chisel plow. We've got the residue, you're thinking, man, that residue should be holding that phosphorus in place. But what's the problem here? The problem is erosion is not an issue. Anyone's been to the Y, it's flat. You're not having an issue with erosion. It's that soluble P, it's that runoff loss. So by incorporating source, that poultry litter, in with the soil, you decrease that amount of soluble dissolved P available for loss and runoff. So in this situation, management actually overrides both the source and the transport because it was the same on this field. The only difference was that management. And, let's look at it again in another example. So we've got a timeline on the x-axis, and on this graph over here, we're looking at total P, that particulate P, right? When they converted to no-till, and some fields still remain in conventional tillage with wheat, we saw erosion reduce 95%. So converting to no-till decreased that particulate P loss. But when we look over here, that same conversion to no-till, when we switch our y-axis and we look at that soluble dissolved P, we see that the conversion to no-till actually increased it. So the tillage actually helped decrease or at least remain the same of that dissolved P loss. So management is not one size fits all. I hope I've hammered that point home. It's field specific. And that's why the PMT that exists right now looks like this. You're taking into account the source, you're also taking into account the transport, but you're also including in that management factor. And you're really helping steer your management by having it part of how it calculates that final score. So you've got surface runoff, dissolved P, erosion of that particulate P, and that subsurface movement of that soluble P. And we feel that this is actually the best way to really capture all the differences in the physiographic regions that we see here in Maryland, right? So when we look at upland, western Maryland, upland PA conditions, we know that the erosion and the runoff dominates, and that subsurface loss is very minimal. And then when we switch over to the eastern shore fields, this is down in Salisbury, we know that the erosion and runoff are almost negligible, and we're really seeing a majority of that loss to subsurface pathways. That's all I'm going to say. I hope I stayed in 25 minutes. I don't know. I talked pretty fast. Should I say something about Chesapeake? Should I say something about Chesapeake now?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Does anybody have any questions? Nicole's also working on another little project, and she's going to talk to you a few seconds about it.
Okay. So for anyone who's not aware, Chesapeake College is now starting a 2-year degree program in agriculture. We're going to be starting our first classes this fall 2016. It's a 2-year Associates of Applied Science degree. So you actually come out with a degree. It's not a certificate. It's a degree. And we're really focusing on hands-on training, out of the classroom learning. We're not going to be sitting in the classroom just listening to boring lectures, I promise you. So if you're interested in learning some more about it, you can check out the website, or you can come up to me. Like I said, I'll be here all day. If you want more information, just come find me or shoot me an email. Thank you.
Buddy Cahill is here from Crow Insurance.
Well, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Nicole. I enjoyed that presentation. I'm Buddy Cahill from Crow Insurance Agency of Middletown, Delaware. We are a nationwide agribusiness agency. In our office, we also do home, life, health, but we concentrate, several of us, on farm policies. And I think we understand them a little bit better because we farm ourselves. I know you've heard me say this before, but I highly encourage you to meet with your agent at least once a year and review your policy. So there's no questions left unturned about what you're covered for on any item, such as your home, your liability, and we need to know personally if you've added equipment, or if you changed an entity, if you've brought family members into the operations which now need to be named as a named insured. All these things we want to talk about, and probably take an hour or two out of your time a year, but it's invaluable. It's something that I highly recommend. So give that a thought. If you're ever interested in getting a quote from us, just contact us and we'd be glad to talk to you. We also do rain and hail crop insurance, and I think all that's been covered already today. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay, let's see. Chris Lanowski is from PNC. So, Chris, thank you for being a sponsor today.
Thank you. So my name is Chris Lesnowski. I'm one of 2 ag bankers here on the Eastern Shore with PNC Bank. A lot of folks don't know that we actually specialize in agriculture at PNC. So our approach is really to try and help improve your cash flow through deposit, lending, and treasury management solutions. So we'd love to get to know you, so feel free to stop by the booth, and we're certainly happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Dale Hawks is here from USDA NASS Statistics, but he's actually at the MDA office, right, Dale?
Thank you, Jenny. My name is Dale Hawks. I'm the Maryland State Statistician. Also, I'm acting for Delaware now. We have lost our state statistician over there, but I'm doing both states. We are in the process of doing our ARM survey, which is collecting a lot of the financial data, and you might have heard from some of our enumerators. Also, we will be doing the March intentions here in about actually it starts today. We'll be out trying to collect information on what you're growing as far as what you're going to grow in the 2016 season. So please fill out the surveys. We will send them through the mail, but then also you'll have the opportunity to talk to one of our enumerators if you don't fill it out when you get the survey. But please fill out surveys. A lot of the important decisions are made by the state and also nationally for the Farm Bill and different things by the information that we get from you. So please fill out the surveys if you get them. If you have any questions, I do have a booth back here. I have information from the 2014 summary, so you can come back and get that. So thank you again for the invite.
I know those surveys can be a real pain sometimes, but they are important and they do use that information. So Brett Schrader is here from Growmark.
Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brett Schrader with Growmark FS. Work out of the Sellersville location. We service mainly the Kent, Queen Anne's County area into Delaware, up north a little bit. Also, as well, we work with our Delmarva team doing a lot of seed plots and stuff like that, doing a lot of innovative things with treatments and testing different hybrids. So that's about all I have. Thanks for the invite.